In today's video, we'll look at the rarest cars found abandoned. From multi-million-dollar supercars hidden under layers of dust to classic icons locked away in forgotten garages. Each discovery is more jaw-dropping than the last, and trust me, the final find will blow your mind. Starting off our list, we have a true American legend, the first ever Chevrolet Corvette, a car that changed the sports car world forever. Back in 1953, Chevrolet built only 300 of these, making them incredibly rare. But one of them was found rotting away in an open field, abandoned for decades. The 1953 Corvette was Chevrolet's first attempt at a true sports car, featuring a fiberglass body and a blue flame inline-6 engine. Unlike the high horsepower Corvettes of today, this one only had 150 horsepower, but that didn't matter. It was a design icon. Over time, many of these original Corvettes were either crashed, scrapped, or restored, but this one? It sat in a field, rusting away, covered in weeds, and completely forgotten. When it was finally discovered, it was in terrible condition. The once glossy white paint had faded, the red interior was completely torn apart, and the engine hadn't run in decades. The tires were flat, and the fiberglass body had cracks and chips everywhere. But here's the crazy part. Even in that condition, collectors were fighting over it. After a full restoration, this abandoned Corvette was brought back to life and eventually sold for over $500,000 at auction. Next up, we have one of the most desirable Porsches ever built, the 1973 Carrera RS 2.7. If you're a Porsche fan, you know this car is special. It was lighter, faster, and more aggressive than a standard 911, designed for racing and performance. Only 1,580 were ever made, and today they sell for over $1 million. So, how did one end up abandoned in a parking garage in Japan? This iconic Porsche was found in near-perfect condition but completely covered in dust. The parking garage belonged to a wealthy collector, but after he passed away, the cars were left untouched for decades. Even though the car had flat tires and hadn't been started in years, it was completely original, which made collectors go crazy over it. The discovery of this Porsche is a classic example of a barn find, where a rare car is discovered in an unexpected place. The fact that it was in Japan adds an extra layer of intrigue, as the country is known for its love of rare and exotic cars. And after a careful restoration, it was brought back to life, selling it for over $1 million. Now, we're stepping into a supercar royalty, the Ferrari F40. This is the last car personally approved by Enzo Ferrari, and it was built to dominate the late 80s supercar scene. With a twin-turbo V8 pushing 471 horsepower, the F40 could hit 201 miles per hour, an unheard of speed back then. This F40 was found inside an abandoned mansion in Japan, completely untouched for over a decade. The car was covered in dust, but its bright red Rosso Corsa paint still shined underneath. The mansion's owner was an ultra-rich collector who disappeared, leaving several supercars behind. The engine was seized, the tires were flat, and the interior was moldy, but this was still one of the rarest F40s in existence. After being discovered, the car went through a full restoration, bringing it back to its former glory. It later sold for over $2.5 million, proving that even abandoned supercars can be worth a fortune. The Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing is easily one of the most iconic cars ever made. It was the first car with the legendary upward gullwing doors, and it was the fastest production car of its time, hitting 160 miles per hour in the 1950s. Today, a pristine one can sell for $3 million, but one was actually found rotting in a junkyard. This particular 300 SL was left abandoned for over 30 years, buried under scrap metal. The once sleek silver paint had faded, the interior was full of rodent damage, and the legendary gullwing doors were stuck shut. But despite its terrible condition, collectors immediately recognized its value. Even in its junkyard state, this car was still worth millions. After a painstaking restoration, this once forgotten classic was sold for over $2 million, proving that even a neglected legend can be saved. Next up, we have the Lamborghini Miura, a car that redefined what a supercar could be. With its mid-engine layout and stunning design, the Miura was the fastest production car in the world when it was released in 1966. Only 764 were ever made, making it one of the rarest Lamborghinis in existence. So how did one end up abandoned in a barn? This Miura was discovered in a barn in Europe, covered in dust and surrounded by old farming equipment. The car had been sitting there for decades, untouched and forgotten. The once vibrant orange paint had faded and the interior was in rough shape, but despite its condition, the car was complete, with all its original parts intact. After a full restoration, this Miura was brought back to life and sold for over $3 million. Now, we're stepping into the world of British luxury with the Aston Martin DB4 GT Zagato. This car is one of the rarest and most most beautiful Aston Martins ever made, with only 19 ever produced. It was designed for racing, with a lightweight body and a powerful inline-6 engine. So how did one end up abandoned in a garage? This DB4 GT Zagato was discovered in a garage in the UK, covered in dust and surrounded by old car parts. The car had been sitting there for decades, untouched and forgotten. The once gorgeous silver paint had faded and the interior was in rough shape, but despite its condition, the car was complete with all its original parts intact. After a full restoration, this DB4 GT Zagato was brought back to life and sold for over $10 million. Next up, we have the Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic, one of the rarest and most valuable cars in the world. Only 4 were ever made, and today they're worth over $40 million each. So how did one end up abandoned in a shed? This Type 57 SC Atlantic was discovered in a shed in France, covered in dust and surrounded by old farming equipment. The car had been sitting there for decades, untouched and forgotten. The once gorgeous blue paint had faded and the interior was in rough shape, but despite its condition, the car was complete with all its original parts intact. After a full restoration, this Type 57 SC Atlantic was brought back to life and sold for over $40 million, proving that even the most neglected classics can be saved. Now, we're stepping into the world of British racing with the Jaguar XKSS. This car is one of the rarest Jaguars ever made, with only 16 ever produced. It was designed as a road-going version of the legendary D-Type race car, and today it's worth over $20 million. This XKSS was discovered in a warehouse in the UK, covered in dust and surrounded by old car parts. The car had been sitting there for decades, untouched and forgotten. The once gorgeous green paint had faded and the interior was in rough shape, but despite its condition, the car was complete with all its original parts intact. After a full restoration, this XKSS was brought back to life and sold for over $20 million. Next up, we have the Ferrari 250 GT California Spider, one of the most beautiful and valuable Ferraris ever made. With only 106 ever produced, this car is incredibly rare, and today it's worth over $18 million. This 250 GT California Spider was discovered in a barn in the United States, covered in dust and surrounded by old farming equipment. The car had been sitting there for decades, untouched and forgotten. The once gorgeous red paint had faded and the interior was in rough shape. After a full restoration, this 250 GT California Spider was brought back to life and sold for over $18 million. And finally, we have the rarest and most valuable car on our list, the Shelby Cobra Daytona Coupe. Only 6 of these cars were ever made, and today they're worth over $20 million each. This Daytona Coupe was discovered in a shipping container in the United States, covered in dust and surrounded by old car parts. The car had been sitting there for decades, untouched and forgotten. The once gorgeous blue paint had faded and the interior was in rough shape, but despite its condition, the car was complete. The discovery of this Shelby Cobra is a reminder that even the most valuable cars can be forgotten if they're hidden away for too long. After a full restoration, this Daytona Coupe was brought back to life and sold for over $20 million, proving that even the most neglected classics can be saved. The restoration process was a monumental task, with every part of the car needing attention. The engine was rebuilt, the interior was restored, and the body was repainted to its original blue. The result was a car that looked and performed just like it did when it first left the factory in 1965. From million-dollar Ferraris sitting in mansions to forgotten Lamborghinis and barns, these abandoned cars prove that hidden automotive treasures are still out there. If you could restore one of these cars, which one would it be? Let me know in the comments.